Hello and welcome. We are living through greater uncertainty than the world has seen at any time since the Second World War. It is almost impossible to say with certainty what might happen next, but for a sharp insight into what could happen next and why, and to help you navigate these choppy waters, we're joined at the India Today studios at the World Economic Forum by one of the world's leading foreign affairs experts, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed, fantastic to see you again. Thank you for your time.
Great to see you, Rahul, always.
We are currently in a situation where Russia isn't winning a war they were supposed to win in less than a week. Ukraine isn't losing, fighting harder than anybody would have anticipated. Where do you think Russia and Ukraine war is going from here?
It's a very good question because you describe it exactly right. The Russians are not winning, the Ukrainians are not losing, but it's fair to say they're not winning either.
Sure.
So you can imagine this moving into a kind of stalemate, which can go on for a long time because the Ukrainians now have a lot of assistance in terms of material, in terms of money. The Russians, it's a much bigger country, it's 10 times the budget of defense budget of Ukraine. So they could also keep going for a while. All of which is to say, I think that this feeling of dislocation, of the, kind of uncoupling of the world, the high food prices, the high energy prices, this is not a momentary thing. This is not a spasm. I think this is what the next year, 2 years, maybe more will look like. This is the kind of new normal.
The fear, though, is that as Russia continues to take losses, could there be a moment, whether it's the sinking of the Moscow or anything like that, which leads to an escalation? What's your reading at this time of Vladimir Putin's red lines? We're seeing new countries wanting to join the NATO. We're seeing generals in Russia speak continually about nuclear escalation. How do you read the mind of the Russian army and Vladimir Putin?
It's a very good question because so far, Putin has been rational and calculating. When I say so far, I mean until about a year ago. I've met Putin a bunch of times, interviewed him once. He's a tough guy, very anti-Western, very anti-American. But he was always rational, cold, calculating. And his decision-making was incremental. He took the little pieces of Georgia that were pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, maybe not pro-Russian. When he went into Ukraine, he took Crimea, which was largely Russian-speaking. Then he nibbled at the Donbass. Then he went further, and always places that are heavily Russian-speaking, always limited in his actions. Syria, he went in for a limited... Now what you're seeing is a kind of weird, emotional... he speaks about the issues in a kind of mythological, which is to say in some sense nonsensical way. Talks about Nazis in Ukraine, talks about how the Ukrainian people are dying to have the Russians liberate them. Even now, I was talking to a head of state who was on the phone with him last week, and he said even now, he says, Ukraine is not a real country, these are not real people, they're all just, in a sense, Russians. So he seems to have gone in a very different direction. And the fundamental issue is this: can he afford to lose this war? Or in his mind, does he think he cannot afford to lose this war? And if that's the case, then your question is very apt, which is, facing loss, will he just escalate? My own sense is that there is probably a place where you could end up, which is he gives back most of the territories conquered in the last 3 months, which are 10 or 15% of Donetsk and Luhansk, those two areas in the Donbass. Ukraine, in turn, says it won't join NATO. Those are the two areas where I think you could achieve it. But getting there is going to be very hard. The Ukrainians don't want to compromise because they've lost. For each side, when you've had losses, it's harder to compromise because then what was the fighting for? So the Ukrainians say, we sacrificed all this and we're going to give away territory. The Russians say, we sacrificed all. So it's a very tough one. My sense is there is going to be some moment at which the Russians realize that they are losing. That hasn't come yet. The Russians are the ones not willing to negotiate, not willing to back down. The Ukrainians have offered several times to negotiate. If that happens, I do believe there is a formula within the realm of possible. I don't know if he would go back to this, but Zelensky, when I interviewed him a couple of weeks into the conflict, said essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, and I mean, obviously these are very delicate issues, but he seemed to be saying to me, look, if the Russians move back, give back all the territory they've gained, we're not going to concede to them Crimea and the Donbass that they took in 2014. We will consider those frozen conflicts. We don't recognize them as Russian. The Russians don't recognize them as Ukrainian, but life can go back to normal.
But that's a big loss of face for Vladimir Putin. He's hoping to go down in history as the modern day Tsar, the great unifier. If he has to go away with his tail between his legs, that doesn't help Putin send the right message.
Yes, so Putin would have to accept that this conquest, this adventure didn't work. But it wouldn't be unraveling the 2014, annexations. But he'd get something big in return, which is the relaxation of Western sanctions. So the question is, how much does he care about that? And again, the rational calculation would be, my God, I mean, the Russian economy is in free fall. But does Putin care?
But are we dealing at this moment, in your best estimate, with a rational actor or an irrational actor?
Everything I've seen about him has always said to me that he was rational. But these last 3 months, he seems to have taken a very strange turn. My hope is that this was a case where he was in a bubble, 22 years in power, 2 years of COVID, completely autocratic system where only yes men and chamchas around him. So he got a lot of bad information. He had his own crazy theories about how they were going to win. Kind of defeat forces a kind of clarity, a reality check, and maybe he will climb down from this. Look, I don't think you can appease him by worrying too much about what happens when he's backed into a corner. The one thing we do know about Putin, and this is now 20 years of history, he respects strength. He respects you if you stand up to him. If you preemptively make concessions and start worrying about what are the off-ramps for him, my advice would be show him strength, let him worry about the off-ramps. There are, as I pointed out, there are a lot of potential off-ramps there. The problem right now is the Russians don't want to negotiate.
If we step out of just what's happening between Russia and Ukraine and focus on the impact this is having on the rest of the world, the one big concern at this moment is because of the supply shocks to food grain systems. How real, according to you, is the prospect of famine, especially in North Africa, and what could potentially be done to try and prevent that?
I think it's a very, very serious problem. I think this is probably, we're almost seeing 3 crises. The first was COVID. The second is the Russian invasion of Iraq. And the third is going to be a global food crisis. Not as much a global energy crisis. We have that. But, energy is largely consumed by rich and middle income countries. They will find ways to manage. Food, what do you do when the poorest people can't get food? What do you do when, in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, even places like Pakistan or Egypt, and when the shortfalls are as great as they are? So this is going to be a massive challenge. One thought would be to try to organize a kind of global humanitarian effort to say, because the food is all lying in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is the world's breadbasket in many ways. I don't remember the numbers, but 8 or 10% of the entire world's calories comes from that one place. And if you could say, take the grain that is in storage in Ukraine, move it out of Odessa. The Russians are blockading Odessa right now, this port city. And, create a kind of international humanitarian shipping mission to just get the food out to feed the world. I think it would also help the global south that has been, in a kind of way sitting on the fence here, to realize this is a real problem. You have to solve it. And, frankly, it's Russia that is blocking it. Ukraine would desperately like to sell its grain to the world, but it cannot because Russia will bomb all those ships. So if you could do that, it might also be a way of just beginning to get us back to, the first part you were trying to get at, which is there some diplomatic endgame. So you begin to talk just about these humanitarian corridors. Maybe you can expand that into talking about more other humanitarian corridors, perhaps even a diplomatic solution.
Some Russians suggested it, saying that if economic sanctions are taken away, then they'd be willing to consider removing the naval blockade. But that's not something the West would be willing to consider, or should it, according to you?
No, of course it can. Look, the sanctions can only be lifted if the cause of the sanctions is unraveled, which is the aggression, the the attempts to conquer Ukraine, the destruction of Ukraine, and what is still, they've annexed about 20% more land than they had on February 23rd. So all that has to be unraveled. The point about the food would be it is literally going to cause a global humanitarian catastrophe. Does Russia want to be the country blocking that? It would seem to me that there would be a path there. But by the way, the fact that the Russians raised this is positive. In a sense, they're saying this is our price for a humanitarian corridor. We can counter with another price. We can say, what about if, one sanction or some measures were taken. The problem so far, though, has been the Russians had agreed to a number of humanitarian corridors within Ukraine to let women and children out. They violated every single one. So, this is one of those cases where Reagan said about the Soviet Union, trust but verify.
We've seen the European Union demonstrate greater solidarity and purpose than at any time in the last several decades. Do you see this EU solidarity last? And what form and shape could it take from a lot of the countries talking about arming themselves? Do you see nuclear weapons proliferate much more than earlier because countries say, hey, maybe that's the only defense we actually have?
I think the most significant development that could come out of this Ukraine crisis is a Europe that decides to be a kind of strategic actor on the world stage. So far, Europe has been the kind of black hole of international politics. Here's this part of the world, 25% of global GDP, I think 35% of global military spending, maybe 40% of global military spending, but totally passive, totally inactive. Their defense spending is all just jobs programs. It's not real defense spending for the most part. What this has sort of, I think, jolted them to realize is, we've been living with free security, essentially given by the Americans, an outgrowth of the Cold War and World War II and, and all that. Maybe security has to be earned. Maybe we have to spend on defense. Maybe we have to deploy those defense resources in a purposeful, strategic way. So a country like Belgium, what are you spending money on for territorial defense? Who's going to attack Belgium? The money needs to, the whole strategic focus of Europe has to be defending its eastern border. That's where the threat comes from. So if that were to happen, I think it's a sea change in global affairs. It's a sea change for Europe, which could become a much more purposeful actor on other things, energy policy, all kinds of things. The question of nuclear weapons will be the ultimate one. I think they won't go there for a long time. I think that they're very comfortable with the American nuclear umbrella. Remember, the British have nuclear weapons, the French have nuclear weapons, so there is an additional layer. But they have the capacity. I mean, the other part of this that we should talk about is what we've realized is the Russian army is disastrous. So the Europeans don't need that much. If the Germans really double their defense spending and all these people start focusing their strategic armament, they will be able to deter against the Russian army. In the old days, you worried about the Soviet army, which was much larger. By the way, this is something India needs to think a lot about because a lot of India's most advanced defense weaponry is Russian. And, what we're watching is that should probably not have come as a surprise to us, but I mean, it's very, very second rate. And it's very hard to see it being able to match the most advanced weaponry in the world, which while China doesn't have now, China is clearly moving towards.
But Russia hasn't deployed some of its most potent weapon systems, whether it's in the realm of cybersecurity, whether it's in the realm of trying to ensure energy blackouts in Ukraine. So a lot of the asymmetric weapon systems that they could have used, they haven't. And even advanced technological weapon systems, either they don't have enough of them and they want to keep them in reserve. But what's your reading of why Russia hasn't been deploying the best of what they have? Because the whole world is looking at the inability of the Russian army to deliver a killer blow.
So it's a mixed bag. I have it on very good authority that they have actually tried to deploy all their cyber arsenal. The problem is the Ukrainian counterattack was much more effective than they expected. Now, it was much more effective because clearly the Americans helped them. but the Ukrainians jammed all Russian cyber efforts. And the Russians turned out to be very bad at cyber. So there's probably a small units in Moscow that are very good at what they were doing, but they got countered. But to give you a simple example, which has not been reported as clearly. So what is happening is Russian soldiers are bringing their phones into battle with traditional SIM cards. The Ukrainians jam those SIM cards, and then these Russians go and buy new SIM cards in Ukraine. All those Ukrainian SIM cards allow the Ukrainian army to target them precisely, which is why Russia has lost almost 10 generals, because these generals were using cell phones with GPS systems that could be tracked very easily. So the Russians turn out to have more second-tier stuff than people realize. The counterattacks are working better. They haven't deployed their most sophisticated missile systems, particularly obviously relating to tactical nuclear weapons. And I think there they realized that would really be crossing a Rubicon. If they were to do that, my own sense is NATO would then get involved militarily, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO. To have a nuclear weapons state use nuclear weapons for the first time since 1945 would be a game changer for the world we live in. And I don't think you'd want to leave that precedent. So there would be, I think, a much more significant NATO and US response.
There's been so much conversation at the World Economic Forum this year about Ukraine and Russia. It almost seemed like the Ukraine Davos. How do you think the mandarins in China are looking at what's playing itself out, and what are they taking away from this conflict?
Look, China is to a certain extent a black box, and Xi Jinping's China is a particular black box because it's really become a bit of a one-man rule. But what we can look at is their actions. So the Chinese have given Russia rhetorical support. Yeah. But what is interesting is beyond that, they have done almost nothing to support the Russians. They have given it no military assistance. They have not even given the military, non-military assistance, by which I mean the Russians apparently asked for food for their army. The army is in bad shape. The Chinese refused to give, MREs, the military rations. The Russians asked them not to give the Ukrainians humanitarian aid. The Chinese have twice given the Ukrainians humanitarian aid, and no Chinese firm or bank is violating the sanctions. And so the picture you get is of a China that realizes that it is not in a good place. There's a very interesting article or paper written by a Chinese diplomat, retired ambassador to Ukraine, in which he said, why are we allied with Russia? Russia is a declining power. Our interests are not aligned. And every year, it's going to cause us more trouble as it's going to drag us down with them. As happens often in China when there is an expression of truth, it was quickly pulled off after a couple of hours off the website it was posted on. But it tells you something, that there is a debate in China going on about why are we hooking ourselves to this sinking star? Uh-huh. So I think the Chinese internal position is probably much more complicated. We'll never see this because Xi believes that he has a kind of an ideological alliance with Putin, which he does. They're both autocrats. They both don't like the West. They both want to stand up to American hegemony. But that's an alignment of ideology. Is there an alignment of real strategic interests? I don't know. I mean, I think we're watching in a weird way play out a version of the Cold War. If you remember, in the 50s and 60s, there was ideological alignment between Soviet Union and China. And then they discovered their strategic interests were parting. In those days, Russia was the senior partner, China was the junior partner. Today, the roles are reversed.
This is a very important year for Xi Jinping. He's up for re-election, which so far was considered a done deal. Do you still think of it as a done deal? Because there seemed to be pressure building in China on account of the zero COVID strategy. We've seen videos of Chinese citizens out in the streets. They've been whisked away to centers where they're supposed to be safe, but they clearly don't feel safe. How do you see these pressures and tensions building up within mainland China, especially in big cities like Shanghai?
So there's no question that China, and this is very surprising to say, but China is stumbling. Uh-huh. Its policy is failing. The way I would put it is they are going for zero COVID and they're getting zero growth. And if you think that's an exaggeration, the premier of China, Li Keqiang, this morning said, we think we are at zero growth. We think we are not growing as a country. just to remind you, their estimate for this year was 5.5%. It will be the first time in 35 years, I think, that China misses its growth estimate. It will be the first time in 46 years that the United States will grow faster than China. So it's a huge deal. COVID is going badly. They have to open up, but once they open up, there will be lots of COVID deaths. Growth is slowing. You also have the reality of China having annoyed all its neighbors. So Xi's policies are not working, but he has a very tight grip on power. Those whole corruption those sweeps, anti-corruption sweeps, allowed him to eliminate a lot of his enemies, a lot of his rivals. So I suspect it would take more than just these few months of bad policy and bad outcomes to dislodge him.
One of the hallmarks of China's rise has been that China has been a very pragmatic power. Now it comes back to the question of rationality versus irrationality. Zero COVID is a clear case of irrationality, but China, because they've kind of, especially Xi's, built it up so much, there's pride, patriotism, ego, vanity associated with it. Will that continue, or do you think they'll just cut their losses and say, hey, we made a mistake and now we need to change course?
So historically, you would say that based on the last 30 years, they would do exactly what you're suggesting. Cut their losses, be pragmatic. That's what they've done in the past, even when they've made mistakes after they've realized it. But Xi seems to be different. He seems to be a more traditional autocrat. The Chinese had a weird dictatorship where it was a dictatorship with term limits. Who has a dictatorship with the whole point of being a dictator is so you can reign forever, right? But they had these two-term limits, and it wasn't just for the senior leadership. Everybody was termed out after 2 terms. This doesn't seem to be that kind of leadership. Look, it's a wonderful example of, we often forget the underlying strength of democracy. At the end of the day, whatever Modi does, there are checks, even for somebody as popular as him and who's been as successful in elections. There are state elections. There are by-elections. There is the reality of, the farmers' protest you saw. There are these checks on your power. There are these checks that remind you that you are human. Imagine being in Putin's world or Xi's world, where there is never any pushback. There is never any point at which you have to recognize failure. There is never a press hounding you, checking you. So I would, the one hope I have for India is that these checks on power, independent media, opposition parties, local legislatures, thank God for the South in India right now. These are all so important to the stability and success of India, because you don't measure this by 1 or 2 decades. You measure this by the fact that, look at India. Since 1947, it has had a stable political system with 18-month exception, right? That's extraordinary.
So 2 things could happen. Either this is just a trip and China just starts running again and they just stumbled momentarily, or because there's such an information void and it's difficult to say what's bubbling within the surface, that this could potentially be a much bigger fall for China. This growth that we've seen, fueled as it is by debt, fueled as it is by a real estate bubble, which has been going on in a very unsustainable fashion according to various Western observers, finally starts taking a hit, and not just temporarily but for longer. Which of the two is more? It's impossible to say, I realize, but which of the two is more likely?
So if they don't course correct, they're clearly headed towards the second, which, by the way, is not a scenario of a Chinese collapse. It's a scenario of a Chinese slowdown. That Chinese growth will move more into the 4% range rather than the 5.5% to 6% range what they're hoping for, which is a big problem for them because they have very bad demographics. They need growth. They still are only a middle-income country. But, the forces that propelled China's growth were the private sector. It was the unleashing first of productivity in the agricultural sector, where they really opened up. Then these sectors like consumers, technology, things like that. The state-owned enterprises in China, the state-run parts of the Chinese economy are as badly run as the state-run parts of the Indian economy. The Chinese do not do any better at state capitalism than anyone else does. Sure. That's the thing people need to understand. It's the private entrepreneurship that Xi is now trying to double down on state ownership and state-led growth. So unless there is a big course correction, I suspect a significant Chinese slowdown for several years. Again, a great opportunity for India.
So let's build on that for a moment. From what you've picked up at Davos and in general, how are you seeing India being able to or failing to capitalize on the opportunity that China's troubles present?
So India is, without any question, the best country positioned to take advantage of these concerns about China, both externally and internally. Externally, the concern that China is becoming expansionist and predatory in many ways. Internally, the reality of Chinese slowing growth. India is perfectly positioned to pick up the slack in some areas by being able to manufacture goods at lower cost than China. In some areas, by being able to manufacture high-tech goods. I mean, that's the great advantage India has. As Manmohan Singh used to say, India exists in several centuries at the same time. So you have low-wage labor, but you also have the extraordinary tech sector. So you could imagine being able to, to deal with Apple on the one hand and Walmart at the other, which are both important parts of Chinese growth if you think about it. You still need a more open, business-friendly, can-do attitude in India. You still need to cut the mountains of red tape that still exists. I've been dealing with some of this personally. My mother died, and so I've been dealing with some of the issues. I mean, the form filling in the Indian bureaucracy, which continues even into the banks now, is just mind-boggling. I mean, you sit there and think to yourself, and of course, all of it is going to lie in some go down somewhere. Nobody's ever going to look at it. Like, why is somebody not able to just cut through all this and look at Vietnam? Vietnam is prospering as a result of all these China issues, but it's small. India has the capacity, the real heft to do it. Modi is doing a good job economically from the point of view of managing the economy. And obviously I'm not talking about non-economic issues, but from the point of view of managing the economy, he's not a Reagan or Thatcher. He's not a great reformer, but he's a competent manager, and he's done it well. And many of the areas which are kind of second-tier reforms which need to be implemented properly, like GST, he's done a very good job. The other piece of India that I think is worth noting is the states are becoming more adventurous, but you still don't have that push, and maybe it's hard to get in a big, raucous, fractious democracy like India. But look, India is going to do well. Will it grow as fast as China did at its heyday? No, that's not possible, I think, in a complicated democracy like India. But that's also okay. Chinese economy was able to double, I think, every 7 years. If the Indian economy can double every 10 years, it's still going to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
What happened in Sri Lanka? Do you see that being unique to the manner in which the Rajapakses ran Sri Lanka? Or do you see that being a potential threat given China's increasing debt to several of these countries, and some of the factors are similar? Do you think it could happen in other places in India's neighborhood and elsewhere as well?
Look, from a strategic point of view, India has to be worried about a Chinese foreign economic policy that is strategically oriented in a way that encircles India. You cannot help but look at the ports that China is financing and notice that they do seem to be encircling one country. I think the circumstances in Sri Lanka were unusual, and I think countries are becoming more aware of it. But look, India has to accept that Pakistan has essentially aligned itself with China, and it has to recognize that reality, and that has very large strategic implications. I think much larger than at any previous point, because China is right there. It's a neighboring country. It's allying itself with another neighboring country with a history of hostility, disputed territory, a history of sending militants into the area to destabilize India. So it has to figure out how to deal with this. Look, one piece of this may be for India to try to have a working relationship with Pakistan to diffuse some of that crisis and that access. I'd be perfectly open to seeing this kind of interesting strategic dialogue between India and Pakistan to try and lessen some of the tensions, because it's to both sides' interest, particularly on the economic and trade side, for that to happen. But the Indians need to realize they do need to think about this and have a strategy, not just, a lot of Indian foreign policy seems to me default. We have default non-alignment. We have default anti-Pakistan. We have default, we need to stop default and actually actively, strategically think about this very new world, as you say, changing more than since 1945. How should Indian strategy change? It can't be that the world is changing so much and it just turns out that Jawaharlal Nehru's foreign policy in the 1950s happens to work perfectly in this completely different world.
India and China's relationship is deadlocked. Is that the way you think it's likely to stay? The People's Liberation Army still amassed on the other side of the Himalayas? Or do you see some of these geopolitical tensions leading to a thaw, even if it's not a very big thaw, but a marginal thaw to begin with?
I'm surprised that China has not made more of an effort to ease tensions with India. It's actually one more of these examples of Xi's non-pragmatic policy. I mean, Chinese have resolved their border disputes with about 15 countries around them. The one country they have not resolved the border dispute with is India.
Why do you think that's the case?
It's an interesting question, Rahul. I don't think anyone completely understands. Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that it involves Tibet, in a sense. The territories are overlapping. And China, if you look at China on issues that are about the control of what it regards as the integrity of Chinese territory and creating a kind of Han-dominated China, in other words, destroying, its separate entities like Tibet, Xinjiang, they're very hardline. They always have been very hardline. And maybe the Indian thing falls into that. Maybe they view India as the only country that could, in Asia, really equal China. They really don't regard Japan that way. They regard Japan as a kind of lesser than country. It's a kind of weird East Asian rivalry. Maybe they view India that way. But it's striking that even, it's been years now since the clash in the Himalayas. Still, the Chinese are not really reaching out, even though they've paid a pretty heavy price for it. And what did they get in return? I mean, a bunch of 20 square miles of frozen tundra. I don't understand it.
And they've got a lot of deployment on their side, building infrastructure. To what end? The sun is setting at Davos. Fareed, what's your biggest takeaway from the World Economic Forum this year?
I think my biggest takeaway was that people have realized that we lived for the last 30 years in a kind of cocoon. We lived from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the invasion of Ukraine. It's almost 2 capstones. And between those years, 30 years of globalization, democratization, information revolution, almost a sense of a kind of common global culture, all that turns out to be, as always in international politics, it's all about power. It was built on American power. The edifice was American power, the undisputed nature of American power, which meant there was the one thing that's absent from that world of 30 years was geopolitical competition, geopolitical rivalry, the tensions that produces, the distortions that produces in economics, because politics always trumps economics when politics flares up. And maybe what we're coming back to is a more normal world, a world that during the Cold War, World War II, World War I, 400 years of European conflict before, it's a more tense world, it's a more unstable world, it's a more dangerous world. But in a strange sense, it may be a more normal world.
Well, a lot of your insights will help those who are watching hopefully get a better sense of this choppy world. And it's always a pleasure having you with us, Fareed Zakaria. Thank you for taking our time.
Thank you, Rahul. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.